Hello and welcome to Power in the Wind. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have chosen to spend the next 30 minutes with us. In last week's program, we saw the introduction of the sting mill and how that was financed on the heads of the enslaved, as it were. We took you to the Sidney Martin Library of the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, and we detailed that compensation money. In this week's program, we shall continue our look at the mechanism of the mill. To do so, we begin at what is regarded as one of Barbados's wonders, and one of the only two intact, restored sugar mills in the Caribbean, situated at Morgan Lewis, overlooking the eastern coastline of the island and the lush Scotland district.
Morgan Lewis Mill, the crown jewel of all the mills in Barbados, the one that has been preserved thanks to a donation made by the Bannister family when the National Trust was first set up. This was one of the first properties donated to the National Trust, and it has been preserved by the Trust ever since. So while the other windmills of Barbados were gutted, the equipment was taken and sold for scrap in many cases, this one has remained. And it's significant too because it is one of the earliest windmills in Barbados, dating from the 1720s, probably on the site of an even earlier, more primitive mill. And it was one of the last to be in operation. Back in 1946, it ceased operation along with Colleton in St. Peter. And so you have a period of some 300 years from the 1640s, when the sugar business began in Barbados, right up to the 1940s, a period of 300 years of the development and change in sugar on the island. The property itself we have recorded in 1674 being owned by Morgan Lewis, and with a name like that, obviously a Welshman. The fields around here, some 300 acres, 140 of which were actually covered in sugarcane. These were the basis on which the mill was constructed, the boiling house behind it, and all of the machinery related to a classic Barbadian, West Indian sugar mill. So here we have an example that has been kept for us down the ages. It gives us a fine base on which to explain the way in which these mills operated. And as we look eastward across the coasts of Cattle Wash, Bathsheba, Morgan Lewis, and that breeze comes towards us, we realize that free power, the free energy that nature has provided to power some, at the peak, some 508 sugar mills across Barbados. And this power is still there. This wind, this trade wind traveling 3,000, 4,000 miles across the Atlantic from Africa, is still there, still possible to be used and utilized for the energy of Barbados. Long before electricity was discovered, you had these hundreds of mills operating, churning out energy, crushing sugar, providing an economic base for what has become the modern Barbados.
Now, this is an important point and what is perhaps one of the more noteworthy statements in the entire series, that modern Barbados has been taken back. Before we continue the description of the Morgan Lewis Mill, Dr. Honeychurch takes us to a scaled-down version of a sugar windmill being preserved in the Sugar Museum at Portville Factory in St. James. He describes its features and mechanism, the same features you will later see here in the Morgan Lewis windmill.
We have a model of a windmill on loan from the Barbados Museum. It gives us a clear idea of the different parts of the windmill and how they operated. And although we'll be actually seeing a windmill in action and of course in situ, it's always interesting and useful to be able to use these models. For instance, first of all, we have the sails, also known as the points, usually 4 of them, with the canvas stretched over the lattice of light wood. This, of course, was put in place whenever they were ready and prepared for the crushing of cane. Your house, made of wood, perched on top of the mill wall, and around the circumference of this, you had a large cast iron metal cog, if you will, that would be able to allow this to move around. And this was managed by this tail tree, which runs right down to the ground. It would have a wheel on it, and it could move in a semicircle. Sometimes you didn't even have to move that far. You just had to shift a few degrees to the left and the right to get the sails right into the wind. And then if you were going to stop the mill, you would then shift this right out of the wind so that the sails were not being fed by it. They were pointing out and away from the wind, and they themselves would be secured with rope around the back of the mill. We see there the inside here would be the wind shaft. Now that is a beam that is coming directly from the center, like the axle of that windmill, of those sails. That's coming down here. Then it is changing and going down the main mill shaft, right down to other cogs here, converting to, in this case, a horizontal rollers, a horizontal crushing machine. In the early days, you would have it going straight down, and you'd have about 3 rollers standing in the center of the mill. So you would not have to create this additional set of cogs to be able to create a horizontal mill. This gives us a great idea of the construction. The elements here, for instance, the bell. This were the times of the running of the plantation: in the morning, midday, or whenever for lunch, break, back to work again, and then in the evening to say the work has ended. It also alerted in case that there was an accident, and there were particular accidents that happened in these mills. Very dangerous operation indeed, very little safety, and you were entirely dependent on the movement of the sails, the rolling of these rollers. You could not turn it off with a key or a button, and if an accident began to happen, if somebody was beginning to be crushed, it was very, very difficult to stop anything at all. And that is why within the mill they usually had a cutlass, a Collins, or an axe to be able to cut off the person's hand so that they would not continue to go into the mill. I knew a lady, she died back in the 1990s, whose hand was like this, and she said that in 1936 she was working late in the night. She was feeding cane into the mill, and she just fell asleep. And just as her hand was beginning to be crushed, the men who were working with her in the mill, picked her up and pulled her out. But in those days, 1936, in a country windmill somewhere way, it was very difficult to get medical attention. And even the medical attention at that time was very rudimentary and basic. And so she lived until she died with her hand bent up, crushed bones. But you just have to think then of what would happen if there had been no assistance and she would continue going into the rollers. All because of the fact that this massive piece of equipment, conducted, powered by the trade winds, really could not stop. It took quite a while, even when you pulled it out of the wind, to stop the momentum.
What a story. Those tales of dangers of working with the mill are seldom told. What a horrific experience it was. Let us leave the model and return to the windmill at Morgan Lewis, where for more than 100 years the equipment was used to crush canes, thereby creating wealth for some.
Although Morgan Lewis itself, the mill that exists right now, had its origins in the 1720s, it stood on the site of a much earlier mill, a more primitive mill, as part of that change and development of the technology of sugar. And we can see that it is quite early because it is made of rubble stone pieced together. Later on, we're going to see that particularly in the 19th century, the development of mills that were produced with cut coral stone, very strong. You could make them much taller indeed. The advantage that Morgan Lewis had, as in the case of Mount Gay and also Portland up in St. Lucie, St. Peter, is that you actually put it on a slope. So you're taking advantage of the height to be able to get a more direct wind coming off the sea. And we see the basic platform on which it stands, the mill tower, the mill wall as we call it, going on up, and the house on top swiveling. It's on rollers swiveling around that you can shift into the wind depending on the time of year. Particularly in the early time during crop, you would have the wind varying from the southeast to the northeast and east. And once again, you had persons who were very skilled in watching the clouds and the movement of the wind and being able to position it. Once you got it in position, and we will see how you use the back there to shift it into the wind, you have these cleats here to tie down the mill. You would turn it out of the wind and then secure it on these, very similar as you would tie a ship to a wharf. And there are many elements within the workings of windmills that are very similar to ships. You could almost say that the windmill teams moved on into the land ships. They were like ships on the land. And these therefore are tied to secure themselves from moving in the wind. When it was crop time and they were ready to actually utilize the mill for crushing cane, they would put on sails, once again, similar to sailing ships. Put on the sails, get the points, as they're called, in line with the wind, and then it would begin to turn. At the back of the mill, we will be able to see the tail shaft, which was the key, the rudder if you want, like a ship, that was going to move it into the wind. So let's go round to the back and take a look at that aspect of the windmill here at Morgan Lewis. One of the greatest changes to Morgan Lewis occurred in the early 1920s when the mill rollers were moved from being vertical inside the mill to horizontal outside. And so what they had to do was to add this shed, this extension, raise the floor of the mill inside, and put new equipment with the main shaft coming down and then a cross shaft connected by cogs to operate this horizontal mill here. And so the changes that occurred were very significant indeed. The platform had to be raised so that the cane could be brought in by hand and put into the chute to go into the rollers. Also, the height of the mill was extended by about 5 feet using cut coral stone. So we see a change in the type of stone used in construction. But it gives us a great example and idea of the way in which this tail tree here was used. And this very long and strong section of wood connected to the house on top, which can move around on the top of the mill wall. This is the tail tree, and this was like the rudder of a ship that moved the entire top of the mill, including the sails, the points, into the wind. And we can see here the track, it's not very long, on which this wheel was pushed so that the entire top of the building was going to shift into the wind. And this was also operated with great skill by men who were able to look to the east. They would see the formation of the clouds, see whether there was a squall coming and therefore things had to stop for a while, see how the constant breeze was reflected on the waves that were coming across. You could look right down to the beach there at Morgan Lewis Beach. With all of these delicate signs and with the knowledge of the workings of the mill, they were able to keep it on track and keep it working for the lengthy periods that were required during crop time. As we see, it doesn't have to move very far because the trade winds in the Eastern Caribbean remain more or less constant, shifting now and then a little to the southeast, a little to the northeast, but generally within a very narrow span. That is why the mills of Barbados did not have to be like the old Dutch windmills or the British windmills in Europe, because up there the wind could be coming from any angle, and therefore the entire mill almost had to move around. Here in the Eastern Caribbean, with the more or less constant route of those trade winds, the movement did not have to be great. What you did have to do, however, is to move the entire thing to the extent and end of the track, to be able to bring those sails completely out of the wind. And then you would be able to tie them along the side of the mill wall to be able to secure them out of the wind, take down the sails, and stop the mill completely. So these are the outside workings of the mill, and now we will be going inside to take a closer look at that machinery which was brought in to crush the sugarcane and to improve on the technology of the earlier standing rollers that existed here at Morgan Lewis. So here we are at the inside of the Morgan Lewis mill, which really is an adaptation of what it originally was. The mill itself is from the 1720s and based on one that was here even earlier. But the thing is that over time, as the technology changed, what you found is that the equipment that was put in was also adapted and changed. So originally this mill would have had a central upright rollers in the center of the mill itself. But when they decided to invest in this horizontal mill that we see here, which is far more efficient because it can actually crush the cane much better, and the rollers are incised, and so they have sort of teeth that can better squeeze the cane. So essentially what happened is they built this shed outside and they put the horizontal bar and rollers here, and then the crop would be brought in and shifted down this way through the rollers. And at the back over here they had what we call a dumb turner. This was an invention from the 19th century, and essentially what it did, it pushed the cane, you could clip it up and push the cane back in here so that it would go for a second or a third crushing. And they called it the dumb turner because before this time, before it was invented, the workers themselves, the slaves, and later on the emancipated laborers, they would be talking all the time. You see, they would be pulling the cane, talking and chatting and throwing it back in. By having this machine, the machine of course couldn't speak, so they gave it the nickname the dumb turner, and it turned back and then ran through the bagasse, went out the other side, and then was taken to fuel the boiling house over here, the furnaces of the boiling house, boiling the teaches to make the sugar. And then the pans, all the juice that would come out would go down in the pans and then be run in gutters across to the boiling house here. But what is interesting with Morgan Lewis as the last working sugarcane mill in Barbados, we have all of the equipment in place, and that when at present there is need for repair, and these repairs are going to take place imminently, you can actually follow the workings of this mill, which is very rare in the Caribbean. There's only one other of its kind. This is in the French island of Marie-Galante, where the mill is in continuous operation. And so what we've got to do now is to look at the mechanism that links up to these rollers to give them the power to roll and crush the sugar cane. So we've got to imagine the force of those sails up there, turning and then connecting on to this wooden spindle made out of heavy-duty green heart or purple heart, usually from Guyana. Earlier on, actually Barbadian grown wood, but that was in the very early days. and then connecting onto this cast iron box there and running down the metal spindle across to this cog here, which is the driving bevel pinion. And then across we have the spur wheel, this big wheel here connecting with the teeth of the cog, and then the horizontal drive shaft in this area here, and the coupling joints which then link all of the drive shaft together and then move on to the 3 heavy-duty cast iron metal rollers. And then you have the force of the rollers crushing the cane. And what we've got to imagine there again is that once upon a time, all of this was very different. You had a much lower floor platform, and you had your 3 rollers standing up here, and the workers would come in and push the cane through the standing rollers, and the same system would operate, but they were vertical as opposed to the horizontal rollers that we have here.
Let us now ascend the heights of the tower of the mill and get a better understanding of the connection there between the sails, the points, the shaft, and the cogs that brought the power down to us below.
And of course also connects to this, which spins around to shift the entire top of the mill in this direction. So when all of this is in operation, you can understand the kind of vibration that is taking place. The force of the wind in those sails, the spindles connected, all of the cogs here rolling, the junction boxes connected to the rollers. There is a vibration that is taking place, and that is why these mills had to be so tremendously strong. We see here the cut through basically of the mill wall, almost 6 feet wide, and that of course continues right around the entire mill. It gets a little narrower as it rises, but essentially the concern is that the mill itself does not crack or break while the force of the wind is turning those sails and the entire machinery is at work. And so the skill that was taken to make and to ensure the strength of these mills without any reinforcing bars, without any special up-to-date concrete. This was done with limestone mortar mixed with molasses and strength of the coral stone pieced together to be able to create this very, very strong mill wall. Many of them you see still across Barbados had to be this strong to be able to withstand the power of those vibrations that all took part as a result of the operation of this equipment.
These mill walls still stand all around Barbados today. Backtrack now to that earlier period. The sails are spinning. The sugarcane is being ground. What is happening to that crushed cane?
So once the juice was crushed by the rollers in the mill, it was channeled in gutters across into this area here, which was the boiling house and distillery. The furnaces were over here. We see the chimney which let out the smoke from those furnaces, and there were all of the teachers, the coppers, for boiling the sugar juice to make into sugar. As the juice came out of the mill across the yard through gutters, it then entered the area of the boiling house, as it was called, and this was the area where sugar was processed and juice was taken off, some of it to go and ferment and make rum. But our focus here is the making of sugar. In the early days, what they had is maybe 1 or 2 of these cauldrons in which they would boil down the juice until it became crystallized and began the process of actually making the powdered sugar. But then in the late 17th, early 18th century, they developed what they called the Jamaica train, where actually you could almost call it the Bajan train, because a lot of it was developed experimentally as the process was fine-tuned, they were able to develop it far more efficiently. But this Jamaica train really consisted of a line or a train of these taches, these boilers, mostly made of cast iron, but a number of them, particularly in the hotter sections, made of copper. So you sometimes hear them described as copper. And you would have these workers here lined up, and they are skilled, very skilled indeed, because they know that when the juice has reached a certain consistency, it is time to move it into the next and hotter boiler. Now the Jamaica train, as it was developed, essentially was underneath of these, feeding heat, a little less hot here, but the hottest was up at the end. And then you had your chimney, so you were feeding the fuel underneath here. That was heating up the hottest, but the heat was also traveling in this direction, and then you'd have your chimney and the smoke would be going out. So your juice would first come in this larger one, boil to a certain consistency, and then the ladler, who here with that skill would then watch the way in which the juice was firming up and decide it was ready to go into here. And using these large ladles, they were able to continually, and remember this work is going on all the time, scooping out the juice and pouring it down into the next stage. And this little last stage here is the hottest of all. So the person who is manning this stage, he is the one that perhaps is the most skilled of all in the boiling house, because he knows when that crystallized juice turning into sugar is just at the right point, and he would call out strike. The sugar is struck. And from there it would then go into boxes, cool, and then into either sugar cones or into barrels with holes at the bottom, so that the moisture that remained would drain out. That would become molasses. But you did have later on, as things developed, something called an oscillator. And this oscillator would be turned to be able to encourage, to speed up the processing of crystals for the sugar. And we've got an oscillator right here across the way at this museum.
And that is how it was done in old Barbados. Next week we shall continue our look at the windmill and some of the different roles associated with its operation. This has been Power in the Wind. We continue to thank our resource personnel, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, and thanks to you, the viewers, for watching. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. See you next week.